Good morning, everyone. My name is Zachary Kelly, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Institute of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at UC Berkeley. And it is my pleasure today to have Professor George Breslauer speak to us as part of this lecture series, Trends and Traditions in Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies that ISEEES has hosted virtually during spring 2022. This is the 13th lecture, so we're hitting the final stretch with two more after today. And I hope you do join us. I think we're doing a nice peek to our final lecture. So today, like I said, one of our own will be speaking with us, Professor George Breslauer. And George Breslauer is a professor of the Graduate School in the Department of Political Science. His areas of specialization are the politics and foreign relations of the USSR, post-Soviet Russia, and the states that constituted world communism. He's the author or co-author of 7 books, including Khrushchev and Brezhnev as leaders, Gorbachev and Yeltsin as leaders, and The Rise and Demise of World Communism, published in 2021, which he'll be speaking about today. He's also the editor or co-editor of 7 volumes. In 1997, Professor Breslauer was given the Distinguished Teaching Award of the UC Berkeley Social Sciences Division. In 1998, he was appointed Chancellor's Professor for combining exceptional performance in scholarship, teaching, and service to the university. I'm also excited to say, as an employee of the Institute, it is thanks to George that we also probably have such a robust program these days for his work overseeing the Institute, especially after the collapse of communism and just the many different things that came with that. So it is my pleasure today to let Professor Breslauer speak to us about the rise and demise of world communism and his interpretation of that, which probably has slightly changed since the publishing of the book in 2021. So please, George, by all means, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to my colleagues in this field. I start with a photograph of the cover of the book that came out last September. Oxford University Press designed this cover, and I find it so striking that I wanted to share it with you. I think it's really quite a remarkable piece of artwork for the purposes of this title. The purposes of the book, well, this is an exercise in comparative communism, from Marx all the way to Xi Jinping in Beijing. It looks at the interaction over time among the internal policies of communist states, relations within the world communist movement, and relations with the capitalist, or what they called imperialist, international order. I wanted to produce a book that was about half the length of most books on this topic of the rise and fall of communism. And it's only 330 pages in length, which is about half the length of the other books on this topic. My book pays equal attention to international relations within the world communist movement and between East and West, if you will, in addition to internal policies. So in order to keep this book from being excessively long, I avoided extensive discussion of the biographies of individual leaders, which you often see in other books, because if it was not related to the theme I was driving, then it was not necessary to go into all the detail about biographies. I also didn't go into detail about the policy-making processes within these countries, instead focusing on the outputs of those processes, and that is the policies that they adopted. And finally, I sought to drive a few themes through the book in order to make it cohere as an argument rather than some sort of encyclopedia. I tried to avoid, and I think I succeeded in doing so, social science jargon that would make the book less intelligible or penetrable to those who are not versed in social science disciplines. And I tried to create a sense of drama. This was the influence of Dan Brown on me. When I read his book, The Da Vinci Code, I was struck by how short each of the chapters were, and how that created a sense of drama, because after 3 or 4 pages, you got to the end of that particular scene and went into a following scene. Well, my 330 pages encompass 43 short chapters, And you can decide for yourselves whether I've succeeded in creating drama, which is not analogous to the Da Vinci Code, but nonetheless dramatic on its own terms. Now, comparative communism as a field sort of took off in the 1960s. And there were books like the edited volume by Donald Treadgold looking at similarities and differences between Soviet and Chinese communism. There was a book that I contributed to as well, Changing Communist Systems, edited by Chalmers Johnson, and then a book I co-authored with Alexandra Dahlin, or I should say, since I was a graduate student at the time, Alexandra Dahlin co-authored with me Political Terror in Communist Systems. Now, this literature on comparative communism was mostly an effort to find a vocabulary that would help us to distinguish Stalinism from post-Stalinism and to distinguish European communism from Asian communism. But there was so much we didn't know at the time. These books came out in the second two books came out in 1970, but we were essentially formulating those books in 1968, early 1969. And there was so much we didn't know at the time. We didn't know what China's Cultural Revolution was all about, how long it would last, what it was motivated by, what its implications would be for both Chinese domestic affairs and foreign relations. We knew that East European regimes were experimenting with various types of what were called minor economic reforms, as was the Soviet Union, but we really did not know how much difference those minor economic reforms would make, nor could we anticipate the dramatic events of the 1970s and 80s. We couldn't anticipate the US opening, or we didn't. You can decide for yourselves whether we should have. We didn't anticipate the US opening to China in the early 70s, the US-Soviet détente in the early 70s, the Khmer Rouge coming to power in Cambodia in 1975 and lasting 4 years until they were thrown out by another communist state next door, Vietnam. We didn't anticipate Gorbachev coming to power in 1985. We didn't anticipate Deng Xiaoping following Mao's death, making such a dramatic turn in Chinese economic policy. We didn't anticipate Solidarity coming to power in Poland, the collapse of communism in Europe and Mongolia in the late 1980s. We didn't anticipate that Castro would last as long as he would. After all, the CIA was vigorously trying to assassinate him or get him assassinated. We didn't anticipate that after the death of Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, that a Kim family dynasty would ensue and that the country would opt for nuclearization. We didn't anticipate the market reforms and the opening to the capitalist international order in China, Vietnam, and Laos. So there was a lot not to have anticipated, and it meant that the literature on comparative communism in the late 1960s was fairly limited in both its focus and its impact. But now we know. So this book is dedicated to looking back on a century-long experience of communism. And so let me outline a few of the central themes of this book. That's what I'd like to do today. I'll speak for another 45 minutes or so and then look forward to an extended Q&A period. One theme that runs through the book is that as I was studying the early stages of all these communist regimes, I was really struck by how similar they were. After the victory of communism, whether it was imposed or indigenous, after the victory of communism, these regimes looked remarkably similar. The consolidation of power by a revolutionary elite took on familiar features. The extolling of revolutionary violence against varieties of class enemies was quite similar. There was a Moscow-centric bloc to which the other communist regimes deferred, at least rhetorically. There was a common anti-imperialist mission abroad that they all endorsed. There was the building of socialism on the Stalinist model, which after all was the only model available for so-called building of socialism after 1928. that Stalinist script was something that found familiar reflection in the policies of these communist states in the immediate years after they came to power. The nationalization of large-scale private property, the collectivization of agriculture, the imposition of a command economy, the adoption of ambitious economic development goals, the extolling of heroic storming in order to meet those goals, vast programs for literacy and for training new generations of technical specialists, social welfare measures to maintain the health of the workforce, a party state hierarchy that extended from the top all the way down to the village level with Communist Party and secret police agencies at all levels, the suppression of autonomous political organization, censorship of the media and of books, deference to Moscow as the leader of the bloc, and regime maintenance plus anti-imperialist struggle as the mission in foreign relations, and one-man leadership. You can find variations on each of these themes in different countries. So Mao and the Chinese leadership wanted collectivization of agriculture, but they didn't want to incur the same degree of death and injury as accompanied Stalin's collectivization campaign. But nonetheless, collectivization was on the agenda. Now, the pathways for following this script were different. I distinguish between coerced emulation of the model, which was the vassal regimes in Eastern Europe and Mongolia, and voluntary emulation of the model by all the rest to one degree or another. They all professed to be building socialism. And in Stalin's last year in power in 1952, before he died in March of 53, his doctrinal position was to freeze this posture in place, a posture of terroristic despotism, a war economy, consumer austerity, monolithic bloc unity, which meant deference to what Moscow wanted, and a confrontational posture, not necessarily going to war, but a confrontational posture toward imperialism and the expectation that there would be war with imperialism at some point when imperialism started it. And that in turn became the justification for all of these other elements of what I'm calling here high Stalinism. So if these regimes all looked in certain respects quite uniform in their early years, the second big theme in this book, or one of the second big themes in this book, is how they all evolved from uniformity to difference after Stalin's death. And that was triggered by the fact that Stalin's successors essentially viewed high Stalinism as unsustainable. And so we got instead Khrushchev's anti-Stalin campaign, the end of mass terror and the subordination of the secret police to the party leadership, greater focus on the consumer, a loosening of discipline within the bloc, arms control with the United States to avoid nuclear war. Now, this turn away from high Stalinism opened the spigot for a variety of regime types and a variety of societal responses within communist states. And that's what I'm calling the drive to difference. What were some of what I do is to categorize the types of regimes after Stalin. One type of regime was high Stalinism, that is to say, high Stalinism maintained. And this was what marked North Korea, Albania, and Mao's China. There's a fascinating or a wonderful quote from Mao Zedong after the denunciation of Stalin, which was not just a denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev, it was a denunciation of the notion of the so-called personality cult. Mao's response was, yes, personality cult is not a good thing unless it is merited. That's not a quote, that's an extensive paraphrase of what he said, but it was a way of basically saying, I may have a personality cult, but I deserve it. That was one variant of the types of regimes. Another variant I'm calling bureaucratic Leninism, In the USSR, it was at its highest point under Brezhnev and Brezhnevism from 1965 to 85. But in Eastern Europe, it also marked the vassal regimes that after the crushing of the Hungarian Revolution and the crushing of the Prague Spring imposed bureaucratic Leninism on those vassal regimes of Eastern Europe. It also marks Cuba since the 1970s. Bureaucratic Leninism is essentially top-down management of the economy and the society without mass terror and allowing of officialdom to consolidate its privileges. And a third variant of the types of regimes after Stalinism was market Leninism. I call it market Leninism. That was basically marketization of the economy, opening to the capitalist world economy while maintaining, hence Leninism, the monopoly of political power by the Communist Party. And I distinguish two types of market Leninism, one marked by narrow scope marketization, and I'm calling that Yugoslavia under Tito. After they started their marketization campaign, pretty much starting it in the 1960s. And then there's broad scope marketization, which marks Deng Xiaoping's China and his successors' China, Vietnam, which followed in the early 1990s to emulate what China was doing, and Laos, which in the 1980s already started emulating what was happening in China. So three types of regimes after Stalin: high Stalinism maintained, bureaucratic Leninism, and market Leninism. Now, these deals were not always acceptable to the societies in which they were imposed, and there were varieties of societal and to some extent elite defiance of these post-Stalin deals offered by first Khrushchev and then Brezhnev. I view Khrushchev as in a transitional regime toward bureaucratic Leninism. So for example, you get worker rebellions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria in 1953, workers' strikes and rebellions that went beyond strikes. In the USSR in 1962, Novocherkassk. In Poland in 1970 and 1976. That's one variant of defiance of the post-Stalin deals. The second variant was anti-communist revolutions. Hungary in 1956, Poland with Solidarity in 1980-81, Eastern Europe in 1989 to 92, and the USSR in 1991. Most of these revolutions, actually the exception was Hungary, were nonviolent revolutions against communist power. They were suppressed. The violent one in Hungary was suppressed by Soviet and Warsaw Pact troops. In Poland, 1980-81, it was suppressed by the regime itself under threat of Soviet invasion. In Eastern Europe, 89 to 92, it was largely nonviolent. And in the USSR in 1991, it was largely nonviolent. And so anti-communist revolutions is another variant of defiance of the post-Stalin deals. Communist democratization from within the party was a third variant. And that's what they tried in Czechoslovakia in 1968, the so-called Prague Spring, which was not driven, in contrast to Gorbachev, was not driven by Dubček. It was acceded to by Dubček, but it was driven from within the higher ranks of the party apparatus and the intellectuals who populated portions of that. And in the USSR, communist democratization from within the party, in this case under Gorbachev, driven from the top of the party, took place. And in both cases, neither of these succeeded, as it were. Czechoslovakia was crushed and the USSR fell apart. Now, there were also varieties of responses on the international scene to loosened bloc discipline in the decades after Stalin. And here I typologize four types. One was unilateral withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. And that's what happened in Hungary in the course of the Hungarian Revolution. That's what they were advocating before it was crushed. The second variant was to keep a foot in several camps, and camps took different forms. So in Tito's Yugoslavia, you had one foot in the Warsaw Pact, even though they were not a member, they maintained a voice within the communist world, and one foot in the non-aligned movement that Tito helped to found and in which he was quite active. Czechoslovakia in 1968 professed not to want to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, but they did want to democratize and lead toward a foreign policy that would have had to have become more balanced between East and West. The Euro-communists in Western Europe and in portions of Eastern Europe were trying to come up with a variant of socialism that would be based on what we saw in Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring, but also looking toward a rapprochement between East and West. Romania played an interesting game under Ceausescu in that he tried to befriend both the Soviet leadership and the Chinese leadership and the American leadership. So he wanted to have his foot in several camps. He did not want to join the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, but he remained a member of the Warsaw Pact. North Korea tried to have good relations with both the Soviet Union and China, which were at loggerheads, because it needed their protection. North Vietnam similarly needed assistance from both in order to prosecute its war against the Americans and the South Vietnamese in South Vietnam. And Cuba was so heavily dependent upon the Soviet Union that while it tried at first in the 1960s to have it both ways, with both being friends to both China and the Soviet Union, it ultimately in the 1970s had to lean more heavily toward the Soviet Union. A third variant is what we'll call schism, and that's what we frequently refer to as the Sino-Soviet split. And that's where China, Albania, and the leading non-ruling communist parties of Asia essentially just withdrew from the Moscow-centric world communist movement. They withdrew, and there was some effort by Beijing to build some consensus among various communist parties in Asia in particular, to have a competing world communist movement led from Beijing, but that didn't really go anywhere. And a fourth variant, which is quite stunning when you think back to what the world communist movement was supposed to be, a fraternal organization of anti-imperialists seeking to expand communism in the world. Warfare among communist states. There were military battles between China and the USSR in 1968 and 69, reaching its apex in 1969. Vietnam invaded Kampuchea in 1979 and overthrew its communist regime, as a result of which China later that year invaded the northern province of Vietnam in order to, quote, teach Vietnam a lesson for having overthrown a communist state that in Kampuchea, previously Cambodia, was more aligned with China than with the Soviet Union. Now, there were downstream consequences of this drive to difference. By downstream, I mean looking decades later. 11 communist states have ceased to exist. The USSR, the Mongolian People's Republic, all 8 East European states have communist states ceased to exist, both the Warsaw Pact states and Yugoslavia and Albania. The Khmer Rouge in Kampuchea, they have ceased to exist. So interestingly, all but the last of these ceased to exist as a result of internal revolutions. It was only in the case of the Khmer Rouge that it was overthrown by another communist regime. And 5 communist states continue to exist in the world. I call them the remains of communism in a post-communist world. And they're really notable for their different variants. In the PRC and Vietnam and Laos, you get market Leninism. In Cuba, you have bureaucratic Leninism. And in North Korea, you have Stalinism. So those three variants that marked the communist world earlier continue to mark the five remains of communism. And there's no longer a world communist movement. In these five countries are each driven by pragmatic definitions of their national interest. There's no coordinated alliance among them, whether tacit or otherwise, among states committed to an anti-imperialist struggle. They are governed, their foreign policy is governed by balance of power politics. There can be hostilities, there can be affinities, but there's not a common interest. Each pursues a distinct foreign policy. So there's no longer a world communist movement. And that's why the title of my book is The Rise and Demise of World Communism. And people typically then say, well, what about China? I didn't say the disappearance of communism in the world. I said the rise and demise of world communism. Well, let me now turn to the matter of explanation. Why the drive to difference in the post-Stalin era? I've typologized the different types of differences among regimes and between societies and regimes. But why? Why did this happen? Well, one thing I think is axiomatic. It would not have occurred when it did had Stalin lived another 10 years. But given his death and the successor regimes seeking to move beyond, quote, building socialism, I think differentiation of response was inevitable. That said, I think the types of differentiation we've witnessed were driven by a variety of factors. So let me list some of those factors, grouping them according to the outcomes they might help to explain. So outcome number one, the delegitimation of Stalinism leading to diverse regime and societal responses. At the elite level, the regime level, I think one part of the explanation is that once you've declared that you have built socialism, you no longer have a script to follow for how to go beyond having built socialism. Marx can't tell you, Lenin can't tell you, Stalin can't tell you. And so it was almost inevitable that you would get varieties of interpretations of both what it meant to have built socialism, and Mao ended up differentiating himself ideologically in that regard from the post-Stalin leadership, as well as what you are supposed to do going forward. So limited practical guidance from the ideological heritage and the doctrinal heritage was one factor. Another factor was the timing of these revolutions. The Soviet communist regime in 1953 had been in power since 1917. The other regimes by 1953 had been in power only about 8 years, if that, 5 years in the case of Czechoslovakia. And some of these regimes had not yet come to power, like Cuba and Laos and Cambodia. But the timing of the revolutions meant that these elites had differential interest in de-Stalinization and in ending the personality cult. Stalin might have died, but Hoxha in Albania had not died, Mao in China had not died, Kim in North Korea had not died. So de-Stalinization and ending the personality cult, not only in those countries, but in various places of Eastern Europe, led to a situation where you could not blame a turn in policy on your predecessor, as Khrushchev could. You could blame it on Stalin. But these other leaders who did not have the good grace to die in Stalin's wake had to figure out how to relate to what it meant to de-Stalinize and what it meant to end the personality cult without, in the process, delegitimizing their own leadership. At the societal level, I think there are three clashes between rhetorical ideals and on-the-ground realities that led to alienation of societies in the post-Stalin era. There's the ideal of abundance, of prospective abundance, versus the realities of the militarized command economy. There's that wonderful saying under Brezhnev that allegedly workers used to say to each other in the factories, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Well, that's a manifestation, one cynical manifestation of the clash between the ideal of the abundant future and the realities on the ground. But a second clash, I think, is the ideal of the final crisis of capitalism versus the realities that had to seep in many of these societies, the realities of growing consumerism and democracy in capitalist countries. Not all of these populations bought into that because they were insulated from that information to a considerable extent, but the intelligentsias knew of it, and there was a lure of Europe among the East Europeans as capitalism started to create greater abundance in East Asia with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and others far outpacing what was happening with the degree of poverty in so many communist states, that this had to create both at the societal and the elite level a certain amount of either demoralization or cynicism about what the regime was saying. And then there was the ideal in the doctrinal heritage of growing political and economic equality versus the privileges of the new class. Now, this is sometimes referred to, it's often referred to as bureaucratism. And there were varied elite responses to these sources of societal alienation. There was, for one thing, varied among the elites of these states, varied elite interest in reforming the command economy. The Stalinist regimes wanted no reforms. The bureaucratic Leninist regimes put their hopes in minor economic reforms, though they would not call them minor themselves. In Yugoslavia and maybe Hungary, if you want to stretch the definition, narrow scope marketization improved the consumer situation somewhat, and more so than in the other bureaucratic Leninist regimes, and broad scope marketization in China, Vietnam, and Laos led to a great deal of economic growth. There was also varied elite receptivity to the capitalist world's attractions. So in the Stalinist regimes, they tried to isolate their populations. In the bureaucratic Leninist regimes, they tried to insulate their populations from too much awareness of what was happening in the capitalist world, though a lot seeped through. And then in the case of broad scope marketization and even narrow scope marketization, there was an opening to the capitalist world, especially in Yugoslavia, less so Hungary, economically, sending guest workers off into Western Europe from Yugoslavia. That was a way of actually solving their unemployment problem at the time. But so isolation, insulation, and opening were three diverse elite responses to societal alienation concerning the difference between the capitalist world and the socialist world's, what I call the communist world's economic performance. And then there were varied elite responses to bureaucratism. That to me is fascinating how varied they were. Brezhnev accommodated it. He allowed the elite officialdom, the new class, to enrich itself and to have no impunity. I'm sorry, to have full impunity from political, so no purges from political retribution. Khrushchev and Castro tried marginally to reduce privileges. They didn't go nearly as far as others would go, but they tried in the name of the ideological heritage to try to reduce the privileges somewhat. Mao mobilized the masses against officialdom in what was like an analog of Stalin's Great Terror, though done through mobilization of masses rather than through the secret police. And that was a way of keeping officialdom on its toes, reducing its privileges, sometimes ending its lives, and ensuring that it no longer ruled with a sense of impunity. The Kim family in North Korea allowed privileges to continue for the elite class, but kept them in a constant fear for their lives. Hoxha in Albania as well. That was more like Stalin's high Stalinism of 1952. It was not like the Great Terror in the sheer numbers of lives or percentage of lives sacrificed among officials, but it did keep them in constant fear for their lives, and that was the deal. You can keep your privileges in exchange for that. Gorbachev ended their impunity through glasnost and electoral accountability, and because he was going for political radical reform, while Deng Xiaoping bought them off to induce cooperation with marketization, basically saying, you are not to use your bureaucratic power to undermine my marketization and opening to the capitalist world economy. And if you do not try to undermine that opening and that marketization, you will get a cut of the action. And that's what I mean by his having bought them off to induce cooperation. It's not just Deng. Deng Xiaoping started the process, but his successors, until Xi Jinping, who's tried to partially roll it back, his successors are the ones that further elaborated it to make for the Chinese economic miracle. There were also varied societal responses to bureaucratism. Bureaucratism was an issue, whatever they called it, in Poland and Hungary of 1956, and helped to fuel those incipient revolution in Poland's case, actual revolution in Hungary's case. Bureaucratism was a focus of Eurocommunism and its calling for democratic socialism. It was a focus of the Prague Spring and made the Prague Spring attractive to society. Receptivity to Gorbachev's electoral reforms was high, and that was because of a sense of gall at the previous impunity of the official class. Solidarity was an effort to basically create a new political system on the side that would end run the official class and basically govern the country in a parallel structure that was not at all accountable to or even communicating with the formal Communist Party structure, to the extent that it was not dissolving itself. In 1989 in Eastern Europe, in China, in Tiananmen Square in June of 1989, and in the USSR under Gorbachev's latest, most radical reforms of 1989 to 91, bureaucratism was an issue. I think bureaucratism becomes an issue in addition to the others of the dysfunctions of the command economy and the shortage economy, because it's a hypocritical affront. Hypocritical because it's so counter to the doctrinal appeal of a vision of political and economic equality, even though the regime had no ideological blueprint for how to create that political and economic equality. It's an affront to dignity. And as we know in a lot of revolutionary situations in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, elsewhere, dignity is a big deal for people who have been excluded until then. And when dignity is affronted, it typically elicits an emotion of indignation. The two words have the same root. And the combination of these varied indignant societal responses to bureaucratism and the varied elite responses to bureaucratism was a precondition for the peaceful dissolution of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and also the transformation of communist regimes, those that chose to transform themselves in Asia. I'm thinking of Laos, Vietnam, and China, and that is elite demoralization. Now, the response to that demoralization took different forms, as I've outlined. But nonetheless, when you get a population that is fueled by indignation, not everybody, but enough of people located in a place to make a difference, and an elite demoralization, you get the kind of combination of an elite that cannot call on Moscow any longer to defend itself, or cannot stomach the idea of continuing with Mao's Cultural Revolution. And that, combined with facing popular indignation, is a precondition, I think, for revolution, violent or peaceful. But then, so that we've been explaining the determinants of difference with respect to the outcome that I've been talking about, and that is societal alienation and elite differentiation. But then there were another outcome was diverse postures toward Moscow's leadership of the world communist movement. And this has always intrigued me. The diverse outcomes nicely correlate with diverse pathways to power. Those who came to power on their own versus those who were imposed. Those who were imposed largely deferred to or were controlled by Moscow's preferences. Those who came to power on their own were largely autonomous. And that led to different choices in the extent to which they were willing to defer to Moscow. You know the litany of those that came to power on their own in Albania, in Yugoslavia, in Vietnam, in China, in Cuba, to a partial extent only in North Korea. But it was, even though the regime was defended by and imposed by the Soviets, it was a regime that, when it came to power under Kim Il-sung, had genuine popularity in the country because of its leaders having fought against the Japanese in China and in the Soviet Union. The pathways to power differed about half and half, autonomous versus imposed, but it had real implications for elite self-confidence and elite self-regard. Elite self-confidence, when you've come to power on your own without having to call upon the Soviet Union to impose you, you have a sense of self-regard and self-confidence that predisposes you to have a voice of your own, not necessarily an antagonistic voice of your own, but wanting to have a say within the world communist movement. And to the extent that that say is crushed, as it was with Tito, obviously, back by Stalin in 1948, it is galling, and it predisposes you in turn, when the opportunity arises, to assert yourself and to assert a different posture toward Moscow's leadership of the world communist movement. It also has implications at the societal level. The regime that comes to power through guerrilla warfare or other types of warfare and is autonomous in that regard, not having had the Red Army put you in power, the regime comes to be viewed by society as an engine of national liberation, as opposed to being viewed in vassal states as anti-national. And it's interesting that all 5 remaining communist states in this post-communist world came to power autonomously or largely autonomously. China, clearly so. Cuba, clearly so. Vietnam, clearly so. North Korea, popular. I've already said that it had a popular, autonomous sense of support within the population, even though perhaps the Red Army had to impose it to avoid the South from overrunning the North. And Laos had its Pathet Lao insurgency and came to power as a result of the Vietnamese army basically installing it. But if you study that history, they probably would have come to power on their own also. What's interesting about these 5 remaining states is that they're all run by a coalition of party leaders and military leaders today, party leaders and military leaders. And that was not the case in European communism or in the USSR, where the military had representation on the Politburo, but was not a large part of the ruling coalition, at least in terms of numbers of representatives at the top. Now, a second factor, I think, that determined the posture toward Moscow's leadership of the world communist movement is the timing of the revolutions. And this I found to be fun, actually. The USSR, well, the founder of the USSR was Lenin, and then Stalin was his successor, and Khrushchev was the successor to Stalin, and Brezhnev was the successor to Khrushchev. Whereas in the other regimes that found different voices within the world communist movement and different postures toward Moscow's leadership, they were led by the founders, Mao, Tito, Hoxha, Kim, Ho, Castro. And so that when the Sino-Soviet split took off, first under Khrushchev and then under Brezhnev, you were having a Mao, the founder of his revolution, being asked to defer to the successor, to the successor, to the successor of Lenin, the founder. And that has to have, so I call that political generational differences among the leaders of these states, founders versus successors. And that has to have had an impact on the incidence of deference and respect. It also has to have had an impact on how you justify your policies, because you cannot change policy dramatically without having to justify it in terms of your own prior policy postures. As I said earlier, these founders, other than Lenin, couldn't reject their previous policies without undermining their own legitimation. Whereas Khrushchev could blame Stalin and call his anti-Stalin campaign a return to Lenin. He could defer legitimacy to the founder. So that I think was another determinant of the diverse postures toward Moscow's leadership. But then there was a third determinant, and that was nuclearism. Nuclearism and risk-taking in the anti-imperialist struggle led to variation in risk acceptance among these regimes. China was willing to invade or counter-invade in the Korean War, despite the fact that the United States had nuclear weapons and had demonstrated that it was willing to drop them only 5-6 years earlier on the cities of an Asian people. North Vietnam was willing to fight to the death against the United States, even though the US had in the background the opportunity to use tactical nuclear weapons against North Vietnam if it so chose. But the North Vietnamese took that risk. They were willing to take that risk. The Sino-Soviet split, the final Sino-Soviet split, which escalated from 1957 to 1960, largely behind the scenes, but then became public. That was really a split over the extent to which Moscow would run nuclear risks on behalf of Chinese national interests. They were counting on Moscow to offer a nuclear umbrella, and that they hoped would help to deter the United States from responding if China was going to challenge the Taiwan regime's autonomy. Khrushchev was spooked by nuclearism. He used nuclear threats to try to get his way vis-a-vis the West, because he was He was trying to have it both ways, anti-imperial struggle and avoid nuclear war. But ultimately, when it came to whether he was going to control nuclear risk acceptance, he and the Chinese broke. And it really became most dramatic in 1957 at a conference in Moscow of ruling and non-ruling communist parties, where Mao declared that nuclear war would not be such a bad thing. 200 million Chinese would survive the war, and that would be enough to destroy capitalism globally. There was a hush in the room after that was stated, and then both leaders of the Soviet Union as well as non-ruling and other communist parties began a denunciation of that perspective. But that was the start of this escalation. And that led ultimately in 1959-60 to Khrushchev pulling back from his technical assistance to China, both in the nuclear realm and the non-nuclear realms. China, during the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, engaged and provoked military clashes with Moscow in 1968-69, despite the fact that Moscow could have obliterated them with nuclear weapons if it so chose, or used tactical nuclear weapons to fend off Chinese troops. And in fact, in the spring of 1969, the Kremlin made a back-channel inquiry to Washington, D.C. as to how it would respond if the Soviet Union decided to take out the nascent Chinese atomic bomb capability. China had the atomic bomb. They successfully tested one in October 1964. But they didn't have, they didn't really have the means to deliver it. But Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon warned Moscow not to do that because they had other fish to fry at the time. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro displayed a Masada complex. He was so spooked by the idea that if Khrushchev backed down, the United States would reinvade, that he wanted Khrushchev to allow him to use those, or allow the Soviets who were guarding these weapons in the Cuban Missile Crisis to use those weapons against the United States, which was not a position that John Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, or any of the others who were discussing this at the time were willing to do. But his risk acceptance was higher. The Kim family went nuclear ultimately and has engaged in nuclear brinksmanship ever since. So nuclearism was a big deal in differentiation of elite postures in international relations throughout the world communist movement from the 1950s onward. So I've been talking about a lot of structural factors, both internal and international, that may shape the parameters within which leaders exercise discretion, but I would not rule out a focus on leaders' predispositions in triggering these diverse choices that drove the difference. Individual leaders' predispositions may determine what choices they make within those parameters that internal restraints and international restraints may impose. Those predispositions may also determine whether they will choose to defy those limits. The founders were typically exceptional. They came to power in largely the pre-nuclear era, as was Stalin. But what of the founders and successors after Stalin? I think you can point to so many examples of decisive and exceptional leadership and innovation. I think without Khrushchev, you would not have gotten an anti-Stalin campaign. There's no sign that others in the leadership were inclined to do something as far-reaching as he did. Gorbachev and perestroika, I don't think perestroika and glasnost and democratization would have happened absent Gorbachev. Tito's defiance of Stalin and his helping to found the non-aligned movement, similarly. Enver Hoxha in Albania and Kim Il-sung in North Korea, their decisions to maintain despotism and Kim's decision to establish a family dynasty are individual choices driven by their predispositions. Mao's break with the USSR, his great leap forward, military battles with the USSR, the great proletarian cultural revolution, the claims about how China would not fear a nuclear war. All of these, I think, have to be traced back to his predispositions, not to structural factors, internal or external. Deng Xiaoping's choice of market Leninism, I think, was a function of his being schooled by the Singaporean leader who had a prescription for combining authoritarianism with marketization and affluence. Fidel Castro, I think his continuing influence all the way into the 2000s kept revolutionary ideals alive and kept Cuba from adopting market-oriented reforms for long. He was constantly leading a backlash against the negative side effects of those reforms. In the rest of Eastern Europe and in Mongolia, there's less need to invoke the names of party leaders, unless your goal is to seek to explain variants of bureaucratic Leninism, of which there were many variants. But if you're just seeking to explain those variants, you have to invoke the names of party leaders. But otherwise, I think memorizing the names of party leaders is not as important as it is in all of these other cases. So my conclusion is that we shouldn't succumb either to great man theories of history, as Carlyle put it in the 19th century, or succumb to deterministic theories of history, as Karl Marx, among many others, also advocated in the 19th century, the idea being that large-scale impersonal social and economic forces determine the direction in which history goes. I suppose if you want to look back from 200 years out, you might come to some different conclusions. But looking back over the history of world communism here, I find more attractive what is called critical junctures theory. And that is to say, yes, impersonal social and economic factors have very strong influence on where you are, but they also generate their own contradictions typically. And then the countries in question typically come to a critical juncture at which choices have to be made. And I think these men, and they were all men, made those choices at critical junctures. And that's why the rise and demise of world communism has been dramatic as dramatic as it has been. Thank you, and spasiba za vнимание.
Thank you very much, George. I'm sure we're getting a virtual round of applause out of the audience. Thank you for a wonderful overview. I feel like I know communism in a way that I did not as well, and it's just nice to kind of see it piece by piece as you move through time from the beginning to the current day. To the audience, I welcome you to submit questions in the Q&A box. I will begin with one that has already come in, but please, by all means, submit your questions and we'll keep this Q&A going. So we have one comment question that came in. In discussing varied elite responses to bureaucratism, you said that Gorbachev ended their elites, the elites' impunity through glossiness and electoral accountability. But isn't it also possible to argue that Gorbachev allowed the elite, that is the nomenklatura, to transform themselves into the bourgeoisie, as Olga Krishtanovskaya and Stephen White argued? If you could speak to that.
Sure. Sure, that's an interesting and a good point. I would agree that, and in fact, the book by Vladislav Zubok that came out fairly recently called Collapse makes that argument. But the argument is not that he allowed them to become a new bourgeoisie. I don't think that was his intention. I think he was so focused on political reform because he didn't really have a taste for economic reform, didn't really know what to do, know what would work. I think he early on drew the conclusion that if you did not destroy the impunity of the bureaucratic class from electoral accountability and exposure, glasnost, that you would never be able to really lead to economic reforms without the bureaucracy sabotaging them. So I would say the side effect of Gorbachev's reforms was that you got this bourgeoisie that grew up in conjunction also with organized crime that was coming above board, but it was not Gorbachev's intention to let that happen. Whereas it was his intention to withdraw the impunity of the bureaucratic class.
Thank you. We have another question. I'm interested in hearing more from you about critical junctures and path dependence. I hear you say that founding of regimes is a critical juncture and perhaps nuclearization. What might be other junctures we might pay attention to?
Well, certainly Stalin's model for building socialism was something that he he drove through. It was not predetermined by Leninism. It was not endorsed by Bukharin and other people of his like-mindedness in the leadership at the time. In fact, in volume 1 of Steve Kotkin's biography of Stalin, he has a lovely chapter on what if Stalin had died in 1927. And he argues that you would not have gotten from any other member of the leadership the same program as Stalin imposed from 28 onward. And so that was a critical juncture, and its outcome was determined by Stalin's script that he imposed. Then, of course, as I'm arguing today, the death of Stalin was another critical juncture. Where are you going to go from here? The death of Mao was a critical juncture in China. The critical juncture in North Korea was the decision not to have de-Stalinization after Kim Il-sung, but rather to have his son take power. And so that initiated there were a lot of choices made at key points in time. Oftentimes, these key points were a product of the death of the founder. So, if Tito had lived another year, would you have had the Yugoslav wars? If Hoxha had lived longer, would you have had the collapse of communism in Albania, and so on? You can go through all of that. So one critical juncture, I think, is the death of the founder. But other critical junctures are products of stress, you might say. North Korea was utterly impoverished. North Vietnam was utterly impoverished after the Vietnam War was over and it annexed South Vietnam and reunited the country. When they saw what was happening in China by the early 1990s, they decided to emulate it, and that was a choice made, driven by a desire to overcome impoverishment. So, I could go through many other examples. Castro's Cuba also. There it was not just the death of the founder, which came much later, but the collapse of the Soviet Union. Their patron, collapse of the Soviet Union led to the collapse in the 1990s of the Cuban economy. Utter collapse of it to an extent that you would call a depression. And they no longer had the Soviet Union to bail them out, as they had had for many years. They tapped into Venezuela and China to some extent, and Iran also to some extent, but that was fleeting until Iran and Venezuela could no longer afford it, and China decided to do other things. So their reactions to economic collapse, even while the founder was still alive, were dramatic as well.
Thank you. Another question that's come in. I've read a lot of analysis on the calculus of the USSR under Gorbachev to discontinue support for the communist bloc states. Can you briefly discuss how the factors you discussed led to the decision to scale back efforts to actively spread world communism, especially in Africa and South America?
Okay, so when you're talking about assistance to communist states, from that question, I assume you're not talking about having signaled the East European leaders that he would not bail them out with tanks again. The Soviet Union would not bail them out if they could not come to terms with their society. That was one respect. But Gorbachev, when Gorbachev signaled to Nicaragua and El Salvador and states in Africa, as well as in Vietnam itself, that the game of anti-imperialist struggle is coming to an end. He was articulating a vision of the future of international relations based upon an East-West rapprochement. He said, our common home from Vladivostok to Vancouver. That was an explicit, as he elaborated it, it was an explicit repudiation of the concept of anti-imperialist struggle, not saying it's unworthy, not saying it's not saying it's a bad value to embrace, but rather saying we can no longer afford it in a nuclear world. Nuclear world, the most important thing is rapprochement between socialism and capitalism, as he would have put it. And so he basically gave notice to the leadership, the pro-Moscow friendly regimes, I'm hesitating to call them communist regimes, in Africa and Latin America and Asia, that the Soviet subsidy and Soviet protection were on their own, were no longer in effect, and they were going to have to come to terms themselves with this changed international order.
Thank you. I'll ask one question while we wait to see if anyone else chimes in. I'm wondering, how do I want to frame this? And I might have just let it slip out of my head. Well, I'm going to ask a different question because I just lost the one I had. And I'm wondering, and I asked this is a little more generalized, but it is for the audience to kind of consider. We have the word communism, we have the word socialism, and I'm wondering how you might explain it as being two separate things and maybe where one fits in the other. And just as a helpful thought, because I think we sometimes forget this.
Thank you for that question. Actually, I have a long footnote in my book. This is not a sales pitch, but I have a long footnote in my book distinguishing among social democracy, socialism, state socialism, or democratic socialism, state socialism, and communism. I use the word communism or communist as an adjective more freely in this book in order not to confuse the reader. I say at the very beginning, I'm just going to call them communist states. You know, many of them did not call themselves run by a communist party. Poland did not call its party a communist party, but for purposes of intelligibility of the prose, I just decided to use that. So I was talking about 16 different communist states, so I would refer to North Korea as North Korea rather than referring to it as the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, because that would be unfair to the reader who doesn't need to absorb that level of detail. I took intelligibility over being literal. So I call them communist. Social democracies are what you have in Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe. State socialism is a term that could well characterize the communist regimes that I'm looking at, to the extent that they maintained a particular type of regime. I would no longer call state socialism what's happening in China, because there's so much extensive private property, same with Vietnam. Socialism has many definitions. In its more extreme definition, it sometimes harkens back to Marx's vision of economic democracy, where workers control their fate within the means of production and the distribution therefrom. So I'm referring to these states all loosely as communist. I tell the reader, however, also that communism as a stage of history is in the cases of Khrushchev and Mao and several other leaders, typically referred to as a stage of history that they aspire to come to as a result of this regime's efforts to build communism. That's how Mao justified the Great Leap Forward, or Khrushchev, his full-scale construction of communism. But it's important not to confuse the state, the historical sequence to communism with the characterization, with the adjective communist of these 16 states. Can't hear you, Zach. You're off.
I apologize. There was some bad weed whacking happening, so I had muted myself. But thank you, George, for that. For separating those words out and kind of parsing them into where they play, both in your research, but I think beyond and into the greater world of when we hear those terms, especially not necessarily misused, but maybe just not used as appropriately as they could be. We have a few more questions that have come in. So a basic question: the number of communist countries has decreased. Has the percentage of people in the world living under communism similarly decreased?
Oh, absolutely. If you're accepting that those 5 states that I continue to characterize as communist are the only ones, then, once you've subtracted the Soviet Union with its over 300 million people and Eastern Europe, and to just subtract those, don't even have to add in Cuba and Mongolia or North Korea and Vietnam. The proportion, of course, of people in the world who live under communism is vastly less than it was, even accounting for the fact that since the collapse of communism, the Chinese population has grown.
Thank you. So not exactly fully on topic, but let's see. I guess, and we kind of have this, I think, in the next 2 questions. People are interested in where Putin today and the Putin regime fits into your framework, and if it even does fit into your framework.
No, Putin does not fit into the framework. In fact, I don't even mention Putin in the entire book. I don't go into any of the history of post-communism. I go into the history of still communist regimes in a post-communist world, but I don't go into the regimes that collapsed and what followed them. Putin is sometimes inappropriately referred to as a communist, but I think that's more in political polemics than in any informed academic thinking. I would categorize Putin as an authoritarian populist whose regime is starting to border on a level of repression that would have to be called highly repressive. So a highly repressive authoritarian populist. And there are any number of them around the world of authoritarian populists, whether in Turkey or in India or in any number of other countries, Philippines under Duterte. But I wouldn't call them communists, and I wouldn't call Putin communist. The interesting thing about Putin is he does not have nostalgia for communism. He has nostalgia for the Soviet state. And after all, he was in the KGB, whose main purpose was to defend the authority of the Soviet state. And what galled him most was when the Soviet state ceased to exist, not when the Communist Party collapsed. And I think that supports the notion of giving him a different categorization, even though it's certainly not flattering of him.
Thank you. I'm gonna just see if there's any other questions. We still have time. Trying to think if maybe to follow up on just that question, would you recommend could you recommend any books that might take where we stand today and kind of where your research ended into this post-Soviet era with Putin? Is there anything that might help the reader kind of see maybe the lack of communism and more kind of his direction, his Putinism rise?
Yeah, I wasn't ready for bibliographical
Sorry.
questions. There's a book called The Red Mirror.
Mhm.
Um, that's one, that's a study of Putinism. There's a study of Putin that is 5 years old now by Clifford Gaddy and Fiona Hill called Operative, Mr. Putin Operative in the Kremlin. That's focused more on him and his personality, while The Red Mirror is focused upon his message and the extent to which it resonates in the Russian population. Um, Elsewhere, I've got a list. Zach, if you want to send me an email, I'll be happy to send you some references.
No, I can definitely
Right now, I'm drawing a blank.
no, that's totally fine. I mean, there's books and magazines and journals and just tons of different ways to approach that topic. Um, I think we might have come to an end. I think we have some questions, and if anything, I think people learned a lot and probably potentially even went to the Oxford Press site and bought your book in the middle of the presentation. But I thank you again. I found this just beyond informative, and it just really kind of cleared up things that get lost, I think, in the details. But
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Yes, no, thank you again. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today and has joined us throughout the semester. Like I said, we have 2 more talks coming up next week. Monica Barr, she'll be speaking about disability histories in the socialist state. And then finally, the last lecture with Professor Kristen Godsey, who will be talking to us about the political economy in an anthropological frame of typewriters in the Eastern Bloc. So we have a couple neat topics coming up, and then hopefully we'll be closing up the semester and we'll take a little break for summer. But thank you again. Thank you, George. And thank you to the audience. I hope you all have a wonderful day.